During college, I dated a fairly well-known and talented local musician named Tim. As horrible boyfriends tend to be in the beginning, he was loving, attentive, charismatic, and a seemingly normal partner. He made mixtapes, cooked me my favourite meals, and dedicated songs to me at open mic nights around town. I, young, foolish and naive, was deeply smitten by his mysterious, dark, artistic allure. However, over the course of our year-long relationship, his mental health severely declined. He had the ability to appear lucid and normal around other people, but in private, he began suffering delusions, lying compulsively, and created art that focused on the themes of murder and rape. I was worried sick about his condition, and it was exhausting, but I did myself to be kind, understanding, and supportive. I loved him, and I believed that he shouldn't have to struggle with his mental illness alone. There was this one time that he vanished without a trace for a full day. I found his apartment empty, lights on, front door wide open, phone on his nightstand. I took a few deep breaths and I called all around the city for hours before finally discovering that he had been involuntarily checked into a mental hospital. I did my best to be strong for him, seeing him every day during supervised visitation hours, bringing him his favourite books to pass the time, and holding him as he sobbed that it was all a mistake and that he did not belong in there. It was surreal for me to see my gentle, intelligent, normal, albeit depressed boyfriend surrounded by visibly insane, long-term psych ward patients. For real, this place was like something out of a horror movie. And in retrospect, none of the staff ever told me the real reason as to why he was there to begin with, and I was too polite and naive to ask. Our relationship ended a few months later. I found undeniable evidence that he was cheating on me, and I was secretly relieved. I confronted him and I told him to leave my apartment and never come back. And that's where he cracked. The gentle Tim I had known and loved melted away to reveal a new persona with dead, wild animal eyes. He threatened to kill himself unless I took him back. But I was extremely done, and I called the police, who actually weren't much help at all. But Tim left. I blocked him everywhere, but he left me insane voicemails from different numbers for weeks afterwards. I was relatively unshaken, and things returned to normal. I graduated, I got a sweet job in the same cool college city, and 6 months later, I woke up to concerned texts from mutual friends saying that they didn't want me to freak out. But Tim was off his meds, clearly manic, and was posting a newly written song all over social media. His best friend, who hadn't been in touch since before the breakup, sent me an apology along with a screenshot of the lyrics. That got my attention. I'm not going to read them out because it will just lead you to his Bandcamp, but the song was pretty explicit about my rape and murder, but in a sort of clever and disguised way. It's catchy too, the bastard. I then went and checked his profile from my friend's account. He was posting dozens and dozens of totally insane rambling statuses, most of them about me. They flip-flop between flowery love prose and murder imagery. His friends were reacting with concern, but a few egged him on, probably thinking that he was just venting about his ex. I decided it would be best to ignore him, and I continued saving screenshots just in case. A few days later, whilst I was at work, I look up from my computer to see Tim enter the far side of the studio. My blood turned to ice. He was talking to our creative director. It looked cordial enough, and I saw Tim begin to casually scan the studio. In horror, I ducked down and bolted into my favourite project manager's office and slammed the door and unleashed upon her what must have been a nearly unintelligible explanation of what was happening. I was shaking so much I could barely speak, but Nancy was amazing. She understood almost immediately, and she snuck me out of the building and drove me in her car to the police station, where I showed the officers the screenshots and filed a report. My co-workers later then told me that Tim was there to inquire about the open designer position. He is not a designer. He had brought with him a portfolio of an elaborately fabricated work history that sounded legit. At the end of his interview, he casually asked if I still worked there. He said that we used to collaborate. Oh, and that he had written a song for me, and it had been picked up by local radio this morning. He asked my co-workers to let me know this, with the warmest regards. That phrase still makes my skin crawl. And then he left, found my abandoned car in the parking lot, and paced behind it until the police arrived. Unfortunately, he was not enough of a public menace for the police to bring him in that day. But the incident helped me to secure a restraining order against him. My company were amazing as well. I was deeply embarrassed about my literally insane ex coming into the studio, but the CEO filed trespassing charges against him and created an action plan to keep me safe in case it ever happened again. Not long afterwards, I transferred to a different city, and that was that. I haven't heard from him since. But I discovered the most alarming part later. His roommate at the time, Liz, went through a similar experience with him during his breakdown. And when we compared notes much later, she told me that there had been a large axe in Tim's car the same week it had all gone down. She said that she was worried about Tim's Facebook activity, so she removed the axe and hid it. Tim was so angry that he completely trashed their house and never came back. And if our timelines are correct, that must have been just before he came into my workplace for his interview.
When my dad was growing up, my great-grandparents lived in a small farming town in Illinois. For the most part, the town was quiet and peaceful. In the mid-'80s, a friend of my great-grandmother, Gina, came to her with the news that one of her sons had turned up dead. He had gotten involved with drugs, and it was suspected that a gang tracked him down. The police weren't getting anywhere, so Gina decided to investigate the murder herself. One night in April, a few months after Gina's son was killed, Gina was found dead in a field. According to my great-grandmother, Gina was very close to cracking the case. However, the death was ruled a suicide by local police, and everybody moved on. Everybody except for my great-grandmother. Great-grandma knew pretty much everything about the case, as Gina had continued to update her as she tried to solve it. So, she picked up where Gina left off and began asking folks around town if they knew anything. One night, my great-grandparents came home from a day in town. Great-grandma went into the house and almost immediately heard the phone ringing. Not thinking anything of it, she picked up and answered. On the other side of the line was a man who said, "If you don't mind your own business, you're going to end up in a field like your friend." The next day, my great-grandfather bought his first gun. Looking back, it's creepy to think that the man on the phone called so soon after they got home. I'm glad my great-grandmother stopped searching and that my great-grandfather took precautions in order to protect his family. Both of my great-grandparents lived long lives, and Gina's husband ended up remarrying and moving out of state. This is my great-grandmother's story. She passed away in 2005, at the ripe old age of 103. This story is family folklore, but unlike most family folklores, which have been exaggerated with time, this one is 100% true.
It's a cold winter's night, and my dad had been drinking wine and a few beers that night before he headed off to bed with his wife, who was my stepmom at the time. He goes to bed fairly late after falling asleep on the sofa usually. Well, it gets to around 3 a.m. He was sleeping in bed, and he awoke to what he thought was someone in his garden, because the automatic sensor garden light had just turned on. And it only does that when it senses there's someone around. Although, it could have been just a cat prowling through the night. He peeks out and decides he can't see or hear anyone. So he decides to ignore it and goes back to sleep. Not sooner had he put his head on the cushion, does he hear what he presumes to be knocking on his door. Not loud knocks, very gentle knocking. Being tired though, my dad said that he just decided to brush it off at the time, as it was really late. Who could possibly be at the door at 3 a.m? And who knows? It could have just been the effects of the alcohol playing tricks on him, he thought, because he was maybe a little drunk. He goes back to sleep, to be awoken up the next morning with loud knocks on his door, but this time by the police. My dad goes and answers the police, and they say that they are inquiring about a murder, which happened only a few doors down, in the early hours of the morning, shortly before 4 a.m. The victim had been hit on the head with a blunt instrument over 100 times. My dad couldn't believe it. He then realised it must have been the people knocking on his door who were planning to murder someone. Could he have been their first planned victim? What if he had gotten up to open the door? All the timing seemed to add up, with the knocking and the backlight coming on as well. Would he still be here today if he had answered that door? What's creepier still is that the people who murdered the woman some doors down turned out to be the people who actually only lived 2 doors away from him. People he used to often smile at and say hello to and just be polite. I can't help but think, what would or could have happened if he'd have opened that door? I still think about how crazy it is to this day.
This story takes place in the year 1912 in a little Iowa farming community named Valicia. One summer day, my great-grandmother was asked if she would like to stay overnight at her friend's house with 2 other girls. When my great-grandmother asked her parents if she could attend the sleepover, she was told that she couldn't, as there was too much housework that needed to be done, but that she could go over the next day after her morning chores had been completed. The next morning, my great-grandmother's friend, her siblings, her parents, and the 2 guests who were staying overnight were found murdered. Police discovered that all 8 people had been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe, was left in the house. The murder has never been solved. To this day, my family's unofficial motto is "Saved by Chores." And yes, this story is used in my family to scare children into completing their housework.